and we will get rolling. Today, I'm very pleased to be partnering with Dr. Joseph Levy on a topic that is both timeless and timely. Assessment of student affairs in higher education and using that information to help improve the way we serve our students is a topic that's evergreen. And Dr. Levy is an experienced practitioner in this area. He serves as the Executive Director of Assessment and Accreditation at National Louis University in Chicago, Illinois. Joe's a member of the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders Board of Directors, and he's also a certified speaker for NILOA. There's a lot more kudos that we could say about him, but I think that we'd all love to just dive in and hear some of the practical strategies that he has for student affairs assessment. So I'm going to hand it off to him, and I'll see you all in the comments and the Q&A.
Thanks, Sherry. Yeah, and some folks are commenting that the chat's disabled, so we can get that up and running soon, everyone, and then you all can be chiming in through there. But hi, everyone. Joe Levy. I'm excited to be here talking with you all. I actually came up on the student affairs side of the house. I got my master's in student affairs in higher education and was working in student affairs. Assessment was actually the way I was able to kind of backdoor into academic affairs and institution-wide assessment and accreditation and many other things. But student affairs has maintained part of my portfolio and part of the work that I engage in daily. So I'm excited to talk with you all today and wanted to give a quick overview for what we'll be looking to cover, so and so that you can think about. Happy to take questions anytime throughout, so you can feel free to either put those in the chat or the Q&A, but know that this is a bit of the roadmap of what we'll be covering in terms of talking high level about the purpose of assessment, and then specifically couching it and explaining student affairs or co-curricular assessment, talking about the benefits for engaging in this work and some relevant audiences to engage, as well as then wrapping up by sharing some resources and fielding questions. So to start, I love to pull this content from Upcraft and Shoe because I truly believe that assessment answers and evidences all of these things. Likewise, in the work I've done at multiple institutions and consulting work I've done, never have I gone anywhere that people did not need to know the answers to these questions. And so I think it's a great way to frame assessment work because this is what it does. It answers and evidences these things. I also love this cartoon because it truly helps us understand why assessment is important, because I think so often we can get so focused on the inputs or so focused on the things that we do and the intentions we have and the expectations we have. But this spells out the fact that, there's a difference between teaching and what you aim to do versus what actually is learned and what happens. And we really need to understand the reality to see how well it matches with our expectations, and assessment helps us do that. And this is just a quick model, but one of the things that I've worked on at my institution is reminding people that this is what assessment should be, right? It should be meaningful. It should matter to people. It should be impactful and lead to change. It should be manageable. We shouldn't be asking things of you that just are untenable. It should be informative. It should both answer and generate inquiry. And it should be robust in the sense that assessment can be used in multiple ways. There's things such as outcome mapping that sometimes people think is just an assessment thing, when really it's a curriculum design thing. It's useful in many ways, and assessment can be leveraged in that way. And I'll just quick pause before I go to the next slide. It looks like folks are figuring out, but the chat is open, so feel free to populate that not only with who you are, but also if you have any questions as we're going along, and as well as the Q&A, and we'll try and manage that as we go. But this is then, again, a very, very simple way to think about assessment, where really I just want to point out the fact that assessment's a process, right? We're defining our learning outcomes, we're setting a plan, we're implementing the plan, we're evaluating it, and we're making adjustments, but that we're continuing to move through that cycle because we know that we always have more students coming. We also, as we make adjustments, we need to reassess those things. We can't just assume the changes we are making will automatically be an improvement. So we need to reassess to see if improvement actually happened. So assessment aside, that's the quick assessment primer. Now let's get into terminology, especially with student affairs at co-curricular. For any folks that are joining and your regional accreditors or institutional accreditors, the Higher Learning Commission, they recently came out with a definition for co-curricular, and it is this. But I have my own definition that's a little more expansive. So, their definition, one of the critical things that people latch onto is this idea that it's complementing the formal curriculum. And sometimes people assume that means it must be tied to or directly linked to the curriculum. This is my definition. It's a bit wordy, but that's kind of my brand. But I see co-curricular and student affairs as, first of all, it's important to recognize that there's passive interventions and activities that are happening, but that they can happen outside the formal academic curriculum. They do not have to be tied to a course or an academic program, but that we know we have these intentionally designed interventions that support student experience and enhance their learning. And these efforts exist for that purpose, right? To educate and support the development of the whole student. So is a student affairs learning outcome going to be tied to an accounting class? Probably not. But that doesn't mean it doesn't count as learning. That doesn't mean that learning or enhancement of knowledge, skills, or behaviors isn't happening in that space. And one is not weighted more heavier than the other. They just are categorized a little differently because of who oversees them. But there are similarities. So here is a typical layout for academic assessment. You can see there's interventions. So we have courses, capstones, academic documents. There's purposeful content, the curriculum, right? There's integrated measures, quizzes, tests, papers, surveys, evaluations. Well, we have this same thing happening in student affairs. It just is not as standardized as it is in academics. So we have tons of interventions, advising, academic, financial, career, workshops, activities, support resources. We have purposeful content, which varies. I mean, the intentions of student activities and student leadership is different than student conduct. It's different than residence life. And those things may or may not relate to classroom learning and classroom-based skills. But we still can have integrated measures. Again, that can vary. Surveys, rubrics, papers, reflections. And so I'm putting them here side by side because they do follow the same playbook. And it's one of the things that I don't know why so many people draw this hard line between academic and student affairs assessment, because in my head, assessment is assessment. Because even if you look on the academic side, assessment for a course can look different than assessment for a capstone. Likewise, assessment in a business class may be different than assessment in an English class. And so just as you can have that variance, but still follow an assessment cycle, it's the same thing in student affairs or co-curricular. And so I really think it's important to point that out, so that also folks who maybe have experience on the academic side and are new to student affairs, it's not as different of a world as you might think. And also for student affairs people to realize that you can start talking a similar and common language with your faculty partners about assessment, and especially around student learning. Okay, just doing a quick look at the chat.
Yeah, I don't see any questions here. There was a little question about the slides, but I think that was self-correcting, so everything's good.
Awesome. All right. So moving on, I want to talk about engagement with assessment, because it's one thing to define it, it's one thing to understand what it is, but how do we do it, and how can we encourage more? So does this sound familiar, especially on the student affairs side? You don't think you impact student learning. You maybe don't have learning outcomes articulated. You don't maybe have a systematic approach. you lack formal reports, or you aren't sure that you can quantify the educational impact of your area. This is where a lot of student affairs spaces are. And I've walked into many spaces like this, both for my day job as well as a consultant, where institutions feel like or are told they have to engage in this space, and these are their initial responses or their initial concerns or obstacles to overcome. This is typically what's going on, especially in the student affairs space. You have a ton of operational assessment, that I like to call it, where you're looking at needs, satisfaction, quality, usage, all important things, but you also need to be looking at student learning, right? We need to be also concerned with the actions, behavior, and knowledge of the interventions that we're providing. And you do need both of these things. So I hope folks also take away is that you don't just go all to student learning and forget the operational stuff. You really need both, right? I mean, if we are evaluating, if we're supposed to put on a workshop that's going to teach students about, it's an orientation workshop teaching them about community guidelines for the institution, and so we're expecting hundreds of students to be there, then yeah, we want to look at the usage. We want to see how many of, if we budgeted for hundreds of students to be there, did we get hundreds of students, and did they find it of quality? Were they satisfied with the information? Were their needs met? But we also want to see, did they learn what they were supposed to about the community guidelines of the institution? And you could have hundreds of students there who were satisfied with the experience or the accommodations or the room, and that could seem like an operational success. But if they didn't walk away learning the community guideline, then that's a learning failure. And you can have the vice versa too, right? You can have students totally understanding the community guideline component, but you only had 5 students there. And so it was an operational failure because you had budgeted so much and hoped to reach so many more people. So that's why we really should be looking at both of these things. But a lot of institutions haven't built out the student learning side of things. And they feel like that can be tricky to fit in assessment, but it's not as tricky as you might think. And one way to do that is look at existing alignment, right? So actually write out what your interventions are per your office or department, and then write out what you think your program or process objectives are, and then draft some student learning outcomes. And you should be able to clearly see how each intervention you have can have some operational components tied to it, as well as some student learning tied to it. And as you draft that content, one, it can help you take stock of what you're doing. It can also help you see how these interventions you're doing relate to these operational goals or student learning outcomes. But it can also be something that can help shape your assessment planning and your assessment initiatives for a given year. This is a very simple example for like a career services office. Here's a more advanced example. This is from St. Paul College. And you can see, well, let me explain what's going on. Up along the top, along the very top, the columns, those are all of their student affairs departments by name and brief definition. And then down along the left side are their divisional student affairs learning outcomes. And so these are the things that as a division are mainstays and elements that they hope are integrated throughout their offices. And then down along the bottom are the college level learning outcomes, and those are notated by these respective icons. And so then what you can see in the actual grid of the matrix there is you can see where the alignment is between the divisional outcomes with the respective areas, the departments, by the X's. Then you can also see where there's alignment and connection and contributions up to the college level learning outcomes. And this is such a good way to visually see the contributions and connections between a given department and the divisional picture and the university picture. And this isn't hard to do. And you can get there from something like this, right? Because you need this type of information in order to extrapolate it and aggregate it to something like this. But it's important to do this not only to have the information for a given picture, but also to show people how these different departments all come together and have their unique contributions, but how it comes together for both a divisional picture as well as contributing to the institution. Now, in addition to outlining your outcomes and putting together how things fit together, you also want to formalize an actual plan for assessment. And I say that because you shouldn't be measuring everything all the time. That's not sustainable. Literature would tell you that you're going to divide your attention too much that way. So it's important to put a plan together that, again, connects your interventions to your outcomes, but also to the measures and to the things that you're looking to focus on for a given year. It can help situate those methods in a larger context, as well as show how a given measure is going to feed information or answer questions about your different goals or learning outcomes. And as part of that plan, you want to have some targets or success criteria, because you don't want to be at the end of the year and look at your data and go, wow, 80% of students said that they can articulate their their leadership style. Well, that might sound great, 80%. That's not bad. But what if you knew last year 90% of students could do it? Well, now that 80% doesn't look so good, right? So by articulating the target initially, you can help cement your expectation. And again, it goes back to this idea of the cartoon, right? Of, well, this is what we expect to see. And by putting that expectation in writing, when you get to the report, you could be a little bit more objective in trying to say whether reality is meeting or not meeting your expectations. And that can be tricky. And that can be a whole conversation about how to go about setting that. But it is important to have those pieces as part of your plan and ultimately as part of your report, so that you can more definitively talk about whether learning was achieved in relation to your expectations for the given year. And much as we're talking about planning, and jumping to the end of the cycle and thinking about reporting, this is what I mean when I talk about reporting. A report is not a spreadsheet. A report is not a bunch of data put together. A report is a narrative that talks through your process, your intentions, your analysis, what you did, what it means. So not just, oh, look, 80%, but what that means in relation, again, to your interventions, to what students are telling you, contextualizing those results with trends or other information for the institution, pairing it with the operational information as well. And then talking about the intended actions. Okay, so we have all this information. What are we going to do about it? Is that going to inform change? Is it going to inform, do we have new questions and new data we need to collect? Is it going to shift the way we collect our data? Is it going to shift our outcomes? Did we think we knew what we were measuring or what our learning outcome was, but as we collected this data, we realized that's really not what we're about, or we need to add a learning outcome? What are those intended actions that you're going to do as a result of this process? All those things together in a cohesive narrative is the report. And that is almost the last part of the process. The last part of the process then is the actual taking action, right? So you put together those intended actions or those suggestions for actions. Now actually do something about it, because if you do not act on the data and the insight you gained, if you just put that report on a shelf, that's worse than if you didn't do the assessment in the first place. Because at least if you didn't do it, you could plead ignorance, or you could say we didn't know any better. But when you went through the process and collected data that told you and raised more questions, or told you how things were going and raised more questions, you need to do something about it. Now, don't put so much pressure on yourself that you feel like you have to know exactly what action you're going to take. Sometimes that action can just be, I need to put together a meeting, or I need to sit down with this department, or we need to sit down with a group of students to talk through which of these potential changes might be most palatable, or might be, from their interpretation, the best path forward in order to achieve a better outcome. That's a perfectly fine intended action to then take action on, see what the result is, and continue to move forward. But we definitely need to close that loop with taking action. And again, taking a step back, this cycle is no different than what academic affairs does. You know, they have curriculum maps and they set plans and agendas, and they are intentional in putting their content into their courses, albeit that's different. But they're still then reporting and looking to take action as well. So again, assessment is assessment, but because, you know, I always say that student affairs is a little harder because you may not have the same requirements or the same compulsion of students to engage, not only engage in the interventions, but also engage in your assessment methods, because you're not dangling a credential like a degree program at the end of the, you know, across the finish line like an academic program can. So it's all the more important when you do get that data collected that you do act on it, because you know, it might be the only data you have. So as you're going along in this process, know that you certainly aren't alone, and there are many other audiences that you should be engaging in throughout this work. First and foremost, your staff. So your immediate team is important to your success. You should definitely keep them informed and engaged in the work that you're doing. Don't let assessment within your team be the potential microcosm of it is at your institution, where only a select few people know what it is or know what's going on. Involve your whole team. Talk to them all about what's going on here, so that they all can play a part and be thought contributors to what you're doing, as well as checking one another with sharing their perspective and pointing out things you might not have thought about, as well as offering resources and connections that they might have. And don't forget about your leaders, which you're probably turning your reports into anyway, but share with institutional leadership about your findings. Use assessment as a lever to gain more resources and campus clout. You know, all the time, one of the roles that I love to play is an intermediary, where I'm working with a given department, I'm looking at their assessment report, and I'm going, oh my gosh, this is so great. And I know that you're fighting for more resources, or I know you're trying to get like another role added to your team. This becomes a compelling way to say, like, look, we're doing well, we're having this impact, and our impact would be even greater if we got X, Y, or Z. So how can we find ways to take assessment data and use it as leverage for strategic planning or other intentional efforts? Likewise, when the reality is not meeting our expectation, again, sharing that with leadership, because it's not a sign, it's not an automatic sign of like a performance evaluation failure of you didn't do your job. Because sometimes it's a matter of, we didn't have enough staff to put on as many events, and so students were dissatisfied with the number of events we were putting on, and because we didn't host as many events, their learning dropped, or the reality of their learning did not meet the expectations we had, because we couldn't do as much programming, or we couldn't provide as many resources, or we couldn't provide as much one-on-one time with students. That's a good argument then to fight for more resources and get more information. And so the more you can keep leadership involved in your work, and the more you can position assessment as a regular part of the work, the more it becomes data that can work for you, and all the more reason to then be measuring things that matter and are relevant not only to you, but to leadership. And I touched on it a bit before, but faculty are also interested parties. So remember the curricular side of the house. And when you're able to put your work in language of learning outcomes, you'll find that you can easily reach some common ground with faculty in terms of relevant skills and knowledge and challenges and successes that they're having with students inside the classroom. Because when it comes to student success, faculty are definitely interested, and they're more than willing to think about how best to integrate and promote beneficial services. So if they know that learning support and tutoring is going to help their students, they're more likely to promote it actively, or more likely to have you come into the classroom and give a presentation, as opposed to just putting a line about it in the syllabus, because you're telling them about the exponential impact you're having with students. And same thing with career services. If you know that you're hearing from students about to graduate who are super stressed, or even students who did graduate and are saying, I wish I would have known X, Y, or Z, or I wish I would have gone to career services, sharing that with faculty so that faculty can also be further promoters and further respond to that information in order to best support student success and help bring these pieces together. And I would also just say, you know, I think this is where sometimes the idea of co-curricular and student affairs and there being this disconnect of things not being tied to the classroom, sometimes it's because many people at the institution may not know any better. They may not think it's relevant to tie these things together and infuse more of these student affairs departments and interventions into the classroom environment. And so the more we can have open communication around assessment and around student learning with faculty and staff, the more likely we can draw those connections, which maybe weren't there in the past. And last but not least, the most important audience that unfortunately higher ed does the worst job trying to engage are students. After all, we're talking about assessment of student learning. That's what assessment is short for, assessment of student learning. And yet we rarely are actually sharing back and talking to the students about their own learning. So please find ways to engage and involve your students in your assessment work. They're giving us the data and they know who we are doing this for. So the more you inform and engage them, the more likely they'll participate in the future. The more they know about assessment, the more likely they'll understand then the necessity behind that survey that's coming to them, or the reason why this information is being filled out for them, or the reason why their papers are also being used in different ways. Or they may then better understand why there's certain reflections attached with experiences, not only to reflect and you know, for their own edification of writing things down and coming to conclusions, but that then the institution or the department is using that information to as evidence of learning, to demonstrate if certain outcomes were achieved. And they have an invaluable perspective to shape just about every part of the assessment process. They can review your learning outcomes and tell you if the language you're using makes sense. They can tell you if it's understood by somebody other than the faculty or staff member. They can also tell you if it's realistic in relation to your interventions. They can also help you think about assessment planning and picking your methods. You might think putting together a survey and hanging flyers around campus with a QR code is going to be effective. Well, they are the students and they will tell you to what extent students are likely to use their phones and snap a picture of a QR code off of a poster on the wall versus respond to an email versus engage in a survey a different way. And then, as I alluded, they are perfect companions to talk to when you get your data in and need to help make sense of it and interpret it, as well as you have that interpretation, thinking about taking actions. You're doing the actions to help them, so why not actually talk directly to them? But unfortunately, and there are very real constraints here, and I know that, I acknowledge that, but there still are not as much efforts and energy towards engaging and folding students into the process as there could be. So I hope you all take that to heart for sure.
So Joe, I threw a question into the chat, but then Brittany also has one in there. So if you want to take a look at hers first, and I think she says, I'm actually trying to engage in more students more in this process. I think referring to what you're saying, involving students in assessments and looking for some practical ways to navigate the conversations with both students and with other department leaders.
Yeah. So, I mean, the best advice I have is treat students like you treat yourself, right? I mean, if we were presenting, if we were calling other staff in for a meeting about, hey, we have this data, what are we going to do to improve this program or take some actions here? You would absolutely give them context. And you would absolutely tell them, like, we only have so much money, or like, we can't change the venue. So what can we do working within these constraints? How can we, while this is maybe the ideal, what can we do realistically? Treat students the same way. Far too often, we don't give them enough credit, and we feel like we're helping by shielding them of realities of higher education, when in fact, if we tell them that these are the things we cannot change, right? Or I hear you, I hear that's something you want to be better, but I can't change that. This is what I can change. Then they'll at least be heard and they got whatever out that they wanted to get out, and then they can talk about whatever the thing is. I've had pretty good success with students, and I will say, like, that kind of approach, you do surface a lot of stuff that I'm always like, and I will pass that to I will pass that feedback to financial aid. I will share that information with that faculty member. I will find ways for your voice to be heard about those complaints. But this is why I'm talking to you. I'm talking to you about this. And given this intervention or given these data, what do you think as a student, right? I just had a meeting last week with some student representatives who are military students. And I said, we just got this data back about our military students, our veteran students. And these are some of the questions we had. And these are some of the interventions we're thinking of. But what do you walk away with, or what stands out to you with this information? And if we did any of these things, which would you find more palatable than another? And certainly there's things where they say like, oh, well, we'd really love this. And I say, yeah, we can't do that, right? Or I had students complaining about like the timing around when they get their VA benefits sort of checked and information back from the government. I said, that is a government problem. It's not something our institution can do for you, because we only play this part in this big process. And so, we can do as much efficiently as we can on our end. But if there is a holdup with the VA at the federal level, there is nothing we can do about that. So like anything else, I think being honest with them and telling them the constraints you're operating on, because you never know too what creative ideas they might have, or you're looking at it a certain way and they might say, well, why don't you just do this? Or students would totally come to a program like that and you wouldn't have even thought that would be attractive. So just to sum up, I'd say just being honest and being, treating them like the adults that they are. Now, are they going to know everything and have as much perspective on the parameters and what's realistic as you? No, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't talk to them like adults and give them, the full scope of things.
We have a couple of questions that have come in the QA too. So Amanda is asking, how do you suggest developing common co-curricular SLOs across departments? And how do you handle CC SLOs that overlap with academic? And she says, for example, NACE's definition of critical thinking differs from AAC&U's and wants to prevent confusion. So that's a lot, kind of two-part question there, and I can read back more of it if you'd like.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a couple things to do. One's not right or better than another. It really depends on what is going to make sense for your institution and the culture of your people. One way is just an organic qualitative analysis. You have all your learning outcomes across your departments. You look for themes, you look for trends, you look for buckets that you can group those outcomes into and organically generate what those departmental outcomes are. Now, as a next step to that, or you can look to the academic student learning outcomes and see how you might align to those and think about, okay, well, we align in these ways, but then there's these groups of outcomes of ours that don't align to those. So then what are the divisional or student affairs related outcomes for those? Because learning outcomes at no level should a learning outcome just hang out there on its own. And so again, I'll give like the academic structure, since that's pretty set. A program learning outcome at the program level of an academic program or major, you can't just have that without having corresponding course learning outcomes. right? Because if it's a program learning outcome, that means course learning outcomes have to feed into that program learning outcome. And vice versa is true too. You wouldn't just have a learning outcome in a course that only serves the course and doesn't serve the program. Because if it doesn't serve the program, then what's it doing in the course? Trim that fat. So you need to have some structure on the student affairs side of things too, in thinking about how your department or your office, the learning outcomes there, what do they roll up to? Do they roll up to general education? Do they roll up to university learning outcomes? Do they roll up to a divisional learning outcome framework? And in embracing that, trying to come up with what your learning outcome framework is, there's a lot of ways to do that. And that's where you can look at things like NACE competencies, you can look at CAS standards and the FALDOS outcome areas. You can look to, just about every functional area in student affairs has a professional organization. A lot of them have learning outcomes that they encourage or say should be coming from their area. So that's another place for support or inspiration or alignment. Yeah, hopefully that helps.
All right, we got a couple more questions too. So Chad says, how do I get my student services colleagues to move beyond operational compliance to a meaningful service quality improvement? So, and that's a topic that is always the big ask. How do we get people to, and I don't love the word buy-in, but how do we get them to buy into meaningful assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes back to that one of that early slides I had of like, what is assessment about, and what questions are we really trying to answer? And when we think about external requirements and what we're mandated to do, I often think that's the bar and the minimum bar that we should, because even programmatic accreditors are still accrediting a given academic program across hundreds, thousands of institutions, and regional accreditors serve hundreds and thousands of institutions of higher education, and even professional organizations for a given functional area. In student affairs, they're giving guidelines for that functional area at hundreds and thousands of institutions. And so even though you are meeting something, a standard or a guidance or an expectation from them, that is still a super generic in the realm of your institution and how unique your institution and your students are. That's a very generic opportunity to apply that. And so if you just do the letter of that, it's not going to have the stamp of your institution. So the more you can keep things grounded in what your institution is, the students you're serving, how you are serving those students with the personal touch, or thinking holistically for them, and grounding people in the fact that, and then this is a way, assessment is a way for us to meaningfully and quantifiably look at the actual impact we are having versus what we think we're doing. Because if we're not doing assessment, then we're just really patting ourselves on the back. We're assuming that all of our inputs are translating to our desired outputs. And so the more you can remind people that this should be answering essential questions for us. This should be answering questions so that we know whether we need to retool a service or a program or an intervention or a workshop, or whether we can leave it alone. And if you are leaving alone, it doesn't mean just stop there. Brag about it. Tell people about it, because that might then help on the operational side of things. Maybe it's this nugget of a resource, but only certain students are using it. Well, start bragging about it and talking about it and sharing the success you're having so that it can impact and serve more students. But that comes when people truly embrace and view assessment as just part of their work, instead of this thing that's being externally imposed upon them or asked of them that is not part of their regular work expectations.
All right, thank you for that. That is always a challenge, both on the academic and on the student affairs side. And I just like to encourage people to start with what they're curious about. within their programming or in their academic program. So we have one more question here. We might have another one coming in the chat too, but one more in the Q&A. Can you talk about how to write affective learning outcomes and how you assess affective learning outcomes?
Ooh, I can point you to a paper about it because that's actually a space that I'm digging more into, both personally and professionally, because, and even beyond affective learning outcomes, it's really important when we're talking about student learning to recognize learning happens in a diverse number of ways. And I don't just mean, I'm not talking about like anything like learning styles or anything, which certainly there's conversation to be had there. I'm talking even just the meaning making process for people, and the idea, the construct of learning outcomes can be a very Western mindset where like we're looking at Bloom's taxonomy, as opposed to things like the medicine wheel or different realms of learning and different aspects of learning. The medicine wheel looks at like mind, body, and soul beyond just like cognitive learning. And so I think that's, to the point of affective learning, we're going beyond just cognition. And I think that's important. And I think there needs to be more education and more practice and examples of that in place for higher ed. My colleague, Vince Nix, is huge on affective learning. And actually, he and I have done some presentations and publications around the topic, but he is very much the guru on it, and I am more the support person and helping provide some data opportunities to assess and examine the extent with which affective learning is enhanced. So I can certainly, feel free to follow up, and I can share some of those resources more directly with you or connect you to him. And I will just say, because I know there's stuff in the chat and the Q&A, I just have a few more slides that I'll run through quick, and then we can keep going with some Q&A here.
Perfect. That's good. And there were some echoes of, yes, please send the articles and resources. So for all of you on the call, you'll notice Joe's got his handle at the bottom of the screen there. And then on one of the final slides, I think he's got some contact information. So you'll all be able to connect with him. And so we'll go on to the next bit that takes care of everything in the Q&A. And while you're gearing up to go again, I'm just going to echo and say, I always told my faculty, just because something's hard to assess doesn't mean it's impossible to. And sometimes those are the most important things. So if it matters to you, if it's an affective outcome and it matters to you, I'll help you find a way to assess it. So yeah, they are challenging, but
there's a great quote. And I'm forgetting the author, but I always use it in a presentation. But it underscores the idea that the moment we prioritize simple or easy in terms of our method of measurement, as opposed to the learning that we're trying to measure, then learning it by definition is second. It is no longer our chief concern, right? And, a psychometric principle is to first clearly define what it is you're trying to measure before you pick your actual measure, because you need to know what you're trying to measure in order to best measure it. And so the moment we come at that work, not holding learning as and not keeping students at the center, but instead something like, well, what's going to be easiest, right? Or what's going to be simplest? Well, then we've already put students second, right? And we've already moved student learning out of being the primary goal, and instead we're already starting to move ourselves into that compliance or check the box mindset of, well, how can we just go through the motions to satisfy whatever need we think is there, because we should be satisfying and working towards students and student learning. And so as much as we start to remove them from the center and place other things there, we're already starting on a bad path. Okay, so we defined assessment and co-curricular and student affairs, so should have seen implications around that. We also talked about the relevance and importance of this work, right? And if you did not see this as relevant, revisit that initial slide from Lovecraft and Shoe with those things, as well as the engagement section, right, to understand the implications and potential benefits for your area. But I'd also stress it's so important to do as much as you can to make assessment meaningful. One of the things that I still do to areas who have, under me gone through assessment for years, is I still will take their report and kind of slide it off to the side and say, did this matter? By participating in assessment, working with me, is your work life different? Are you seeing differences in how you're running your area or the way you're serving students? Because if not, then we likely didn't do as good of a job as we could have. And there's no point in playing the blame game or pointing fingers, because I might have okayed something when I should have applied a more critical lens to it, or you might have told me like, no, this is the extent with which we're covering learning for this, and so then I didn't know any better to push more on that. But either way, we didn't do as good of a job as we could have, because it wasn't meaningful to you, because you felt like it was going through the motions, or this is a report that you could have just skipped, right? I actually love hearing that feedback, because then it gives us something to really dig into and move towards a place where people will be as equally passionate about assessment work as I will, because it's actually meaningful to them. But it takes effort on both ends to make it meaningful, and to not just go through the motions or accept this task or assignment given to you and just focus on getting it done. So it's important to establish your expectations. What do you hope students learn or experience? And what do students want to learn and experience? Answer those questions for your area. And then think about how you can bridge the gaps between those two, and how you can best measure student learning and success. And explore your barriers, because there will be very real barriers. I know that this presentation is talked about assessment as pretty straightforward and everyone should do it, but I know there are very real barriers to this work. Let's start naming those to see how you can minimize and overcome them one at a time, or make progress on minimizing them. And thinking about how assessment can be more meaningful and useful, as well as how you can better engage more audiences in this work. Because I guarantee there's at least one audience, one population that you could be further engaging with your assessment work. And so one major branch of resources, specifically around student affairs, is the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders. We are a nonprofit organization that solely exists to support student affairs assessment professionals and people engaged in student affairs assessment. We run our own journal, we do webinars, structured conversations, we have a podcast, we have a blog, and we have an open course, or a MOOC, that we run in partnership with Weave. And I'll tell you more about that course. It is 8 self-paced modules that consist of a discussion board each week, a quiz almost every week, 2 written assignments, video lectures, personal take videos from past participants, some required reading, tons more further learning and readings and resources to really dig into content. And we have some small groups and live sessions. We've had almost 10,000 people go through this course. We've ran it 6 times. This February will be our 7th run of the course. These are the topics that it covers. So basically, just about everything you might need to know, and some of the questions people have been asking about in terms of methods and data, and really developing a culture, as well as this idea of coaching and consulting with assessment. You can earn a badge if you earn a 75 or better on all the quizzes, as well as the written assignments. But here's when the course runs. And one of the things that I would establish or make clear is that, especially if you look at this timing and think, oh, it's terrible for me, right? Like, I am not free during those times. First and foremost, this course is a resource. So even if you don't think you'll be able to engage during that time, still sign up. You get indefinite access to the course. As I said, like from our first run in 2017, people still have access to that course shell. So you can access it whenever is convenient for you, even if that February to April window doesn't work. And what I will say is, if you are engaging with it outside of April 2nd, when the course closes, you won't get that badge, but you can still access all the materials and information, which that's kind of the gold mine of the course anyway. So if you want more information, please check it out. and feel free to contact me because I run the course and I'm happy to answer questions and talk about it. And it's free. So you literally lose nothing by signing up, even if you forget you signed up and never go back. But I would highly encourage it because it's got so much information in there. And it was built with, we had over 30 different institutions help put us together, and more have helped us over the years keep things refined and update content. So I'd strongly encourage checking it out.
Hey, Joe, will you go back for a second to the slide that had the 7 or 8 things that are covered in the course? And a quick question, one that came up in the chat earlier, it's kind of buried now. But somebody was asking about the difference between direct and indirect assessments.
Yeah.
And so if they sign up for the course, will that be covered in one of the modules?
Yes, we cover that a bit in, I believe, module 2, but we also have handouts around picking methods, and in the further learning section there's also tons of information around taking. And when you get to like module 6 around using data to inform decisions, it talks about that too, around the type of data you might be using and how it might be perceived by others, and just in general too, we talk about the balance of data, and that to that person's point, their accreditor or somebody wants more direct measures, but that doesn't mean they want you to throw out all the indirect measures, because those still have value too. So it's kind of like the student learning and the operational component from the beginning. You don't just move then everything to only measuring student learning and forget the needs, usage, satisfaction, and quality data, because that's still important. But you do want to have this balance to give this fuller or more complete picture around what's happening.
Perfect. Thank you. And it looks like you have some alums here in the webinar, and they're giving a shout out and saying it's in module 2. So,
Yeah.
So they know where it's at. So that was thanks, Megan, for that. So we do have a couple of more questions, and I don't know, you might want to go back to your resources page now so people can grab your contact information. But there was a thread a little ways back, and James was asking some questions about the challenges of getting leadership to agree with and operate according to that principle of let's be honest with the students about what we can and can't do. So he was just looking for any practical suggestions to get more alignment between leadership and assessment leaders on actually operating that way.
Yeah. And those are battles I still fight every day. I think with assessment, it's a lot of times a game of inches, and you take the wins where you can get them and the advancements where you can. And just like as you're working with different departments, some people will be initially gung-ho and they'll go all in, whereas others will be a bit more hesitant, and others will dig their heels in. And you got to go with the momentum you have. And so I try and build a coalition of leaders that support and engage and believe in assessment, so that it's never just me talking about the importance of assessment, but that I can look around the room and have others articulate the importance as well, and the relevance and how meaningful it is, and how it has helped inform some of their strategies and the decision making they do. But sometimes even when you have all of that, you can only get so far on transparency as well as institutional support. And so I think you make the moves where you can. Like one of the things for me, like this year, because I've been actively trying to engage many more students, and even though it should really be happening from the respective academic programs or the student affairs departments themselves, because that isn't happening as much as it should be, I'm actively engaging like our student assembly, our student council, and having some reps working with me and sitting in on our university assessment council, so that they can gain more exposure and be involved in more assessment conversations and ask more questions. And so then as they're asking more questions, then that's circulating them through our student assembly board, and our university assessment council is seeing that interest. And it's only further adding pressure to the academic programs and the student affairs departments to engage students themselves, because then I'm getting students asking me questions of, well, hey, why don't I know this information about my program? Or why isn't this student activities department sharing this data with me? And I'm like, those are great questions to ask that director of that office, or to ask that director of that academic program. So I think where you can use what you can, and use the interest and your your position and positionality within the institution to try and move the needle on these things. And by doing that, one of the things I got worked into our strategic plan for the institution is more transparency around assessment, and to engage more communities and key populations in talking about and engaging around assessment and student learning work. And so then I'm on the books. I can point and say that this is an institutional strategic priority to increase the transparency and engage more populations like students in this work. But it took me a couple of years to get those things in the strategic plan, and building some campus capital and coalitions to do so. So hope that helps.
Great. Thanks, Joe. I think we've worked our way through really well through the questions, and we're winding down on time. And a few people are signaling that they've got other events to go to, which we understand the Zoom hop that goes on. I think we have another slide or two that just has some Weave information about upcoming events. QR code. Did I put that in there, or did I neglect to add that last slide?
Oh, nope. Here it is. Got it.
Okay. All right. I thought I did. So, so thanks to everyone for coming. If you want to, before you sign off, grab that QR code. It'll take you to an easy sign up place to get more information about Weave's upcoming offering. I'm going to put in a quick plug for two things. Linda Susky is doing a curriculum mapping workshop next week. We still have a few open seats. It really started filling up today. So if you're interested in that, go to the Knowledge Center, sign up quickly. And then in 3 weeks, we have Tisha Paredes and Stephen Biscotti leading a general education assessment 4-week course. And so it's a good deep dive, and you'll leave with actually a plan in place for how to lead gen ed reform and keep assessment at the forefront of that at your institution. And that one is enrolling now also. There's several seats open in that, and we would love to have you join us in Weave Academy. And I know Joe would love to see all of you in the course. So I put the link in for that as well. He had it up on the screen, but I put it in the chat if you want to scroll back up and grab that before you sign off. Joe, thank you immensely for a really engaging and informative session. There's lots of thanks coming in the chat. Everybody, I think, got something to take away from this. And so we appreciate everyone giving up some valuable time this afternoon for the topic of student affairs assessment. We'll see you all in the next Weave Academy event, we hope.
Thank you all.